And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I can't see you, but I know you're all very brave people because you read one of Baldwin's most unapologetically uncomforting books during election week.
Can you hear me?
Is that Hilton? I think Hilton has just
I'm
arrived.
sorry, my internet was down and I was just waiting because that's what we do. Imani and Eddie, and I'm so happy, and Julian, I'm so happy to see you. And I get to tell Imani and Eddie how much I love their books, and so we'll have fun.
Okay, good stuff.
And it should be secure by now. I unplugged everything and then plugged it back in.
Excellent.
That is fantastic that we have Hilton here now. That's much better than what I was going to say. You know, I wanted to say that I know every single book event, they say that the book is timely. So I'm in a boy who cried wolf kind of situation. But in the case of No Name in the Street, it's really true. Baldwin wrote it in 1972. It's a very personal look back at civil rights from the standpoint of the backlash after the assassinations and in the midst of a great fracturing in the country and in the struggle. And at the same time, it's a book in which Baldwin comes to the point of questioning America on a more fundamental level, as many of us have since this summer's historic and ongoing uprising against police brutality. So it's a difficult book on every level, which is one reason I'm thrilled to be welcoming our brilliant panel. This is really the all-star team of Talking Baldwin, and beyond that, of carrying on his work and spirit in their own. I'm going to get started with the introductions. Hilton Als is the author of The Women and White Girls. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2017 and is a staff writer for The New Yorker magazine. Eddie Glaude Jr. is the James S. McConnell Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University. He is also the chair of the Department of African American Studies and author of the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. And then finally, Imani Perry, who is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is the author of 6 books, including the award-winning Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry. Her most recent book is titled Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. You should read all 3 of these books that I've held up and everything by these 3 panelists. So they can't hear you, but give them some applause at home. And with that, we can get started. So I have particular questions for each of you, but the beauty of a book club is that we've all read the book. So I wonder if we could actually begin with a moment from the text. For me, one of the most important encounters in No Name in the Street is when Baldwin goes to Harlem to give a suit to a childhood friend. It's the suit that he wore to Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral, and the friend has read in the newspaper that Baldwin is never going to wear it again. So for Baldwin, the suit is soaked in the crimes of the country, but for the friend, it's just a suit. So he calls to ask for it. As Baldwin writes, Martin was dead, but he was living. He needed a suit, and I was just his size. So Baldwin goes over to give him the suit, and they argue about the war in Vietnam. Baldwin actually cusses out the man in front of his mother because he uses the word we to describe the American war effort. And Baldwin is just so angry that this Black man is capable of seeing himself in the American we of this imperialist America. At the same time, Baldwin understands the man's pragmatic attachment to this country. In other words, he wants the suit, whether it's bloodstained or not. So you can say whatever comes to mind about this moment, but I'm curious about what Baldwin is saying about the Black attachment to the idea of America, this kind of the fear that America itself, the idea of America, may be incompatible with Black freedom. And yet so many Black Americans keep coming back to the idea of America and trying to make it include us again and again. So whichever of you would like to begin.
Well, I don't mind. What do you? Should
Sure,
I
go ahead, Hill.
Go ahead.
Please.
for a second? One of the things that I love about the passage that Julian is talking about is that the Baldwin also has an encounter with the man's daughter, who starts to attack William Styron's novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner. And at one point, Baldwin is listening to her and he realizes that she hasn't read the book. And he says, well, I suggest that you read the book before you attack it. And it seems to me that it's a parallel argument that or criticism that he's making about the man that he's giving the suit to, talking about our America, and this young woman talking about our Blackness, that there's no critical discourse, that what he's walked into, it's almost as if he stepped out of the 60s and entered in sort of Alice in Wonderland fashion in the 70s, or the start of the 70s. And he's perplexed by the lack of critical inquiry. It begins with an impulse to help, and at the same time, he's confronted with the lack of critical inquiry. So that's maybe, I'm thinking that that's one of the ways that he wants us to start the book, that with the death of the 60s, literally and figuratively, and the beginning of a sort of ideology that doesn't take critical conversation into consideration. It's a confusing moment because he's living in a confusing time. It's what you said, Julian, and in your introduction, that it was very, the book itself is kind of indicative of where we are, and I couldn't agree more. That we are at a loss for language. It's that great thing that those people don't want us to know anything. That's part of the argument that's going on now. So anyway, that was a long way of saying that I love that section too, and I particularly like his take on that with that girl.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Good. I'm saying, I find it a very rich moment in the opening of the text, and I would push us back a little bit, almost to the beginning, but I think there are a couple of things that are going on, that are happening here. One is the effect of a certain kind of middle class bliss.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense in which the fact that, how did he put it on page 19 in the vintage edition? He says, how could he support the Vietnam War? How could he, right? And he says, what for? For his job at the post office? Right? That's the question, right? And then he says, and the answer came back at once. Yes, for my job at the post office. Now, we know already, those of us who are Baldwin readers, that the expectation of him to get a job at the post office, to get married, to have children, right, was the kind of that middle class aspiration, right? He rejects it, by throwing the wedding rings into the Hudson, as it were, right? So there's this sense in which the friend represents the distance, the gap between him, right, and the people for whom he loves, to whom he's indebted.
Right.
And that gap and that distance has everything to do with his own celebrity.
Well,
he's trying to give.
Right. He says that he has that wonderful moment where he talks about taking the limousine.
Long Cadillac.
He said it's appeared so ridiculously long by the time I got to this.
Exactly. Right. So there's this sense in which Baldwin is trying to give us, because in the beginning, what he's doing is marking time. And he's trying to give us a sense of the distance, at least in my view, between him, right, and the childhood best friend, Black, he says, right, that made him so much. But I can go on. Professor Perry, I'm sorry.
I mean, I absolutely agree with both of your brilliant observations. One of the things that I'm taken with is something that he does characteristically, in that Baldwin makes no pretense to sort of existing in the sort of ordinary bourgeois world. He's very clear about the distance of the intellectual, the critic, as it were, and yet also maintains this deep sense of respect, right? So in the moment of interaction with his friend where he's enraged and then he has a feeling of shame, right? And the daughter, he comes out of the other side, right? One, acknowledging that he has ruptured something because he has engaged with them on terms that are not the terms of their lives, but two, to understand that part of the job of the critic is that he cannot expect a particular kind of mutuality, right? It's sort of the formulation that I have a responsibility to this family. I have a responsibility to love them. I have a responsibility to offer an interpretation, not in a condescending fashion, right? But I also am not, he doesn't pretend, he has no pretense that he's a kind of everyday guy, right?
Right.
And that kind of humility, but also a reckoning with the fact of what it is that his particular calling is, I find really remarkably honest. I think it's a hard thing for us to do.
Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, just the image of him in this limo, I think there's a moment where he actually like apologizes to the people of Harlem for being in this limo. Like, I'm sorry, I'm just going to give a suit to a friend. And yet it is this very celebrity and this distance, as Imani mentioned, that lets him see beyond this kind of pragmatic middle-class patriotism and kind of attachment to the American dream.
And remember, Julian, he's framing this. He's already described himself as someone who's experiencing the guilt of the survivor.
Right.
Right? So he's used that phrase. And then remember what the suit represents. He tells us, right? The suit fit his friend perfectly. But then you get that passage. For that bloody suit was their suit. After all, it had been bought for them. It had even been bought by them. They had created Martin. He had not created them. And the blood in which the fabric of that suit was stiffening was theirs. So there's a sense in which he's thinking about his own, how they in fact possess him, right? And his own role. So there's this way in which he's trying to mark distance and time. There's a way in which he's trying to do, I mean, I can go on and on and on, but guys, I'll shut up. We can go
No, that seems exactly right. I mean, it's he's at the same time saying that he needs to see beyond the way that they've constructed their world, but that it's for them, and that's important. And
it's very interesting what Eddie is saying, because and what Imani is saying, because one of the things that this book club has made me do is really look at the structure of the book again. And the structure is profound because he begins with this conversation about essentially Black masculinity, right? And the separation and the divide that can happen within. He wants to go back home, but you can't go home again. And then the end of the book, he's in the company of Huey and Eldridge, which is this sort of new Black body politic that he has no place in either. He has the understanding of being an elder, but he's not accepted. So the book has these two frames where he's trying to go backwards and he's trying to go forwards. And he's stuck in the present and in himself. And I think that's what Eddie is saying, is what happens to you when you realize that your body is not your own. If he's saying that America's bought the suit, and Imani is saying that humility, it's sort of like this kind of weird disappearing body, right? He's not belonging to the past and he's not belonging to the future. It's one of the saddest books I've ever read, and it got really critically, it didn't do well because I think that the radicalism of the structure was way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
I think that's very, very true. And this kind of not having a body or not having a place, it's very familial in the way that he talks about it. You know, I know in his earlier writing, he talked about Black Americans as kind of the bastard children of the West. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit about family in the book, which of course, you know, starting it, I couldn't help but be struck that the first words in the book are Baldwin's mother's words. And this is a question for Imani, though of course you're all welcome to answer it. So Imani, your book Breathe is about the vocation of mothering Black sons in America. And like No Name in the Street, it's also very much a kind of diagnosis of America. And so my question for you is, what do we learn about America when we look at it as though it were a family, as Baldwin does? And how can writers, and particularly Black writers, sensitively connect questions of family and family life with what we might think about as national family life? Like, when is private life exemplary of national life, and when is it projecting?
So this is really interesting because I think, I mean, part of one of the, I think, most powerful metaphors of this book is actually talking about his father's first son, right? And how he experiences the abuse, essentially, that Baldwin would experience, and rejects the family and departs, right? And then he talks about re-encountering that brother and says, I encountered him as the person who made his father's name famous. And in the process, by making his father's name famous, I have betrayed my brothers and sisters. Now, it's a powerful metaphor, of course, because the father is both the not biological father, the father who raised James Baldwin, but it's also a metaphor for the nation, right? Yes. And what does it mean to function as this kind of exceptional, famous, right, kind of heroic figure, and grappling with whether or not this is a question of a betrayal. And it's really, I think, a question about American exceptionalism, but also about his exceptionalism, right? And so he's consistently sort of engaging in this question, and what's one of my favorite parts about this book, solidarity with others who are oppressed, whether he's talking about the Viet Cong or he's talking about Algerians, this understanding that under the banner, he's really betraying the banner of American imperialism as a kind of presence. It's a way of, in some sense, exploiting what it means to have become a favored child, right? By virtue. Yes. And so I think, that's in sort of ways an avoidance of the question you asked, but I do think this it becomes a craft question, right? Because the intimacies of our lives are endlessly complex. Whenever we present them, we are presenting them as part of an argument, right, that we want to make about, life or humanity or love or, and so I guess I think that for me, the question is always how to ensure that you can reckon with intimate structures that are too infrequently rendered, but not it being, for lack of a better way, sort of like a vomit of one's personal life all over, right? But rather that it becomes a vehicle to talk about questions of for me, I think for many of us, of race, of belonging, of what it means to dissent, to depart, to go, to be the prodigal child, as it were, right? Yeah. Just to be part of this story as well. Departs, comes back.
I love that association of kind of the personal betrayal of the brother with, needing to betray America in a certain sense, and doing it for a good reason in both cases. And it actually reminds me of a question you ask in Breathe, Imani, which is, how do you become in a world bent on you not being and becoming? It reminded me of a line of Baldwin's in this book, where he says that America's a society in which nothing was harder to achieve, nothing's more scorned and feared than the idea of a soul's maturity. And maybe the answer in both of those cases is a certain kind of betrayal. that takes on a familial kind of resonance. And so I don't think that's an avoidance of the question at all. In a related area of this book, so Hilton, you were bringing up masculinity before, and in this book, as much as in any of Baldwin's books, the question of masculinity and also of sexuality is so central to what Baldwin has to say politically. And I know that in your work, especially the beautiful show that you curated about Baldwin a few years ago at David's Werner, you've really emphasized saving Baldwin the human being, and particularly Baldwin the queer man from Baldwin the anti-racist totem. Right. And so I wonder if I could ask you, what do Baldwin's thoughts on masculinity, on love and lovelessness, and on sexuality add to our understanding of him as a political thinker?
Well, it's very interesting in rereading the book. I was so sad to feel a kind of self-loathing at the end, especially vis-a-vis meeting Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. And he has this very sad moment where he talks about Eldridge having been in jail with faggots and sissies, and he's had enough of that to throw up, is what he says. I'm paraphrasing, but he uses those words, and it was so devastating for me to read that again and to realize that he never really left Harlem in terms of its perception of his sexuality. And he never left his father in relation to his sexuality, particularly when it came to love. That if you can use those words and say that you understand someone else's repulsion, that it's within their right to be repulsed by you, by your queerness, it doesn't leave a lot of room to be loved. And it doesn't leave a lot of room to have intimacy of love with someone. Because part of the joy and the frustration of being with someone is that they strip you bare. They want to know. And he's able to do that on the page. But I think in passages like that in the book, it shows you how far removed he was from his own body, and that status quo, or that Eldridge Huey sort of axis of Black masculinity in the 70s was right to kind of criticize him and criticize it. So I think for me, it's political, because anything connected to ourselves and our bodies is political. But on a personal level, it's just devastating to know that is not the attitude that allows for intimacy. And it's self-hatred is what it is, in that way. There are two parts of him that are always at work in this book, which is Imani talks about the guilt of the survivor, and then the expression of that guilt of having survived. It's a devastating book on that level, but so I think I don't really, Julian, have an answer or a definitive answer about what it means. I can only talk about how it affected me very deeply, to know that he felt that way about himself.
That is that's such a hard passage to read. And, particularly because when discussing repression and self-hatred among white Americans, Baldwin is so clear and incisive, when he talks about the kind of Southern white liberal friend of the Negro who gropes him in another one of the book's most difficult passages. He can see so clearly how this lovelessness, as he calls it, this is related to how the politics and the self-loathing connect. And yet, as you're pointing out, when he's talking about Eldridge Cleaver, that analysis is not there so much, and it's difficult to read.
Can I ask a question? Because that was really profound for me here. What you just said, Hilton.
Imani, your sound, I think it's
Oh, can you hear me better
much
now?
better. Much
better.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. You know, this question that I'm consistently grappling with for Baldwin is he's very concerned with masculinity and the way white supremacy has limited. He talks about manhood a lot, right? And he talks in this frame that is very kind of conventionally masculine, right? That is one of the lenses through which he talks about white supremacy. And so your observation also sort of is helping me think through the way in which he in some sense, he occupies a maternal position, like the long-suffering mother, like he sort of enters a different kind of conventional position. And I just wondered if that is a dimension of precisely what you're talking about, right? That there is this self-effacing in addition to self-loathing, self-equality that is about, I can take I can be the one who suffers in service.
But why is it always in his books, in Giovanni's Room, if they're tell me how long the train's been gone, the homosexual as martyr,
right?
And it's something that he criticized Gide for, right? But it was exactly what he was doing himself over and over again. Why does homosexuality become equated with martyrdom? He doesn't allow for its complexity. It's almost as if he allowed for it, then if you allow for the complexity, then you have to allow for love as a gay man. You have to allow for the complexity of the soul and the person. And he's never able to do that.
So Hilton, what do you say he can do it on the page?
In fiction in particular, actually.
Because I'm thinking because in No Name, what releases him as he goes to Paris is he falls in love.
And with Lucien.
Yeah, he falls in love. And then he gives you that wonderful passage, right? Where where he actually gives voice to vulnerability. When a naked body is upon you, right? Remember that passage early on in the text, right? So there's a sense in which he gives voice to, he doesn't name it explicitly, right? But he says he fell in love, and that love released him into a different way of seeing himself and seeing the world. And now he does say at the price of the ticket that, I never thought anybody could love an ugly boy like me. Right. So there's that wound that's still there. Right. But in the context of this book, there is this kind of another kind of framing, right? Where he opens up with what love unleashes, and then how he's reading, right? The distorted sense of masculinity that has infected Cleaver, and how that leads him to misread him. And he's deeply wounded by that misreading. Am I misunderstanding?
No, you're completely correct that he is wounded by it, but then he makes an excuse for it by saying that at the time when I met him, do you remember this part, Eddie? I hadn't read what he wrote about me, but he had every right to, however he, as Sharifa Rhodes Pitts calling doing the Jimmy, right? Where he does a big rhetorical leap. And you're like, wait, what happened to the facts of this? As you know from your research, the love that he found in Paris was actually incomplete and not reciprocal. So perhaps I'm reading too many too much into that section about love, but it was not,
No.
it wasn't complete, and it
No,
wasn't
no,
reciprocal. And Lucian was interested in women.
right.
So the love that he's talking about feels, you can't write fiction without experience, and it feels like fiction based on slight experience.
Fascinating.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that also comes across when he's talking about masculinity and the South. And there's a moment where he actually says, the only thing that keeps the South from being a totally homosexual society is the absence of men, and that seems to be a kind of really hard to read equation of homosexuality and emasculation, that which speaks to what you were saying, Hilton, about him never really leaving some of those ideas.
Yes.
So my next question is for Eddie. So one of the most wrenching aspects of No Name is especially, in the year 2020 is the way that Baldwin is really anatomizing the disintegration of the civil rights coalition, from the friend who supports Vietnam, but mostly the white liberals who sort of support Black freedom until they realize what it entails. And I'd actually like to quote a section here. So he's talking about white students who had been involved in civil rights. What the white students had not expected to let themselves in for when boarding the Freedom Train was the realization that the Black situation in America was but one aspect of the fraudulent nature of American life. They had not expected to be forced to judge their parents, their elders, and their antecedents so harshly, and they had not realized how cheaply, after all, the rules of the Republic held their white lives to be. So that really blew me away, particularly at this moment. I think we're at a time when more white people than ever are willing to say Black Lives Matter. Even Mitt Romney was marching this summer. But at the same time, the resistance to fundamentally altering the country seems unchanged. So Black Lives Matter, but you begin to speak about reparations, you begin to speak about defund the police, or even changing the national narrative with the 1619 Project, and suddenly this huge groundswell of white support vanishes. And so I wonder, Eddie, if Baldwin is right that you can't end racism without ending not just prejudice, but a certain idea and attachment to America. Are we any closer to that today?
Well, I don't want to prejudge. I want to be very careful in doing that because we're still in the middle of it, or near the end. I'm not sure yet where we are, but it seems to me, given our history, one could reasonably conclude certain things about the shallowness of the way in which we are responding to the moment. There's that line in Baldwin on page 165 where he says, white America remains unable to believe that Black America's grievances are real. They're unable to believe this because they cannot face what this fact says about themselves and their country. And the effect of this massive and hostile incomprehension is to increase the danger in which all Black people live here, especially the young. That seems to me so appropriate for our own moment, right? That there is still this kind of refusal to see our ghastly failures, to look our ghastly failures squarely in the face, to understand the depth of the lie and how it cuts to the secret chambers of our heart, right? That it's not just about race, it goes to our very private interior selves, right? And I think one of the striking things about this book, and I just want to echo something that Hilton and Imani have been saying in some ways, is that there's, in so many ways, and Hilton made this point, that the book is so far ahead of its time at the level of structure, because Baldwin is trying to capture at the level of form, rather, pain, wound, betrayal, fractured memory, trauma. He's trying to figure out how to write that. And so The book is moving forward, lurching forward and back, remembering, misremembering, to use Toni Morrison's language, disremembering, trying to telescope history, right? Trying to give a sense of what follows from the betrayal. And even after, you were right to say that he invokes, the first words of the book are from Bertus, his mother. The first name in the dedication is to Bertus.
That's right.
But then he takes it, then you can't trust anything. He tells you not to trust a word. Look at what happens. Look at the next sentence of the first sentence of the second paragraph. Much has been blotted out, coming back only lately in bewildering and untrustworthy flashes. Right? And then you get may, remember, memory. I mean, all of the way in which he opens up is telling us as the reader that what follows will in fact reflect, right, the effects of betrayal and wound. As he said, this was, excuse my language, this book was the mighty motherfucker that he could barely finish, right? And so, but I think at the level of form, it speaks directly to our moment, and the moment that where we face and confront the question whether or not we will finally rid ourselves of the lie and its distorting effects.
The passage you were just reading, Eddie, reminds me of another line of the book where he says, the mind is a strange and terrible vehicle, which kind of welcomes us into this really wild ride where the structure is dictated by trauma and this kind of shuttling between history and psychology, which really characterizes all of his work, but particularly this one. And I wanted to ask if there are there any kind of limitations to that approach of moving between personal trauma and the link between character and politics? Are there limitations to that? Because we've been talking about this moment, and it struck me that Trump has been in many ways the ideal president for exemplifying Baldwin's theses about the personal and political. It's a man whose lovelessness and failed masculinity, sex crimes, and spiritually empty private life seem really totally inseparable from his racist politics in a way that almost seems like an allegory or something. But of course, as we've seen this summer, the same racism, the same racist policing and disenfranchisement can take place in cities where the mayor has a Black son, or even where the mayor is a Black woman at the hands of Black cops. And so I just wonder, what are the limitations to reading our politics in this kind of mode of shuttling between the private sin and repression and the public?
What are the limits? Baldwin has that line in the text. I'm not sure yet. Let me just say that. He has the line in Take Me to the Water where he says, he quotes the Socratic dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living. Because Baldwin wants to hold on to the view that the messiness of the world is actually a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives. Right? So that the parallel, right, is constantly being made. It doesn't mean that he's not attentive to structures. It doesn't mean that he's not attentive to the operations of power. He actually has an extended reflection on power in this text. He's not going to simply aestheticize all matters. He's not going to reduce it simply, right, to a kind of self. It's not only about a kind of self-regard, right? And so I think, though, the relationship between, right, the refusal to address the wounds of oneself and then the moves we make in the structures we actually build that reflect it, to reflect that denial and evasion. So if we're going to really build a world where we can create a self without the need for enemies, right, then it's going to require a kind of honesty. So I'm not sure what the limits are of that. Maybe because I'm too smitten with Jimmy right now. So
well, we love him, and we want him to know that We love him. The point I was trying to make about love before, I think, Eddie, is that because you fall in love doesn't mean that the other person falls in love with you.
Right.
You know, that he's fallen in love with someone who can't love him back, or love him consistently. And I wonder if his being drawn to the idea, Julian, of disenfranchised people was emphasized by his loneliness, that he begins to understand, seeing the Algerians in Paris and seeing other peoples of the world, that his loneliness translated to the world, that all the anguish that he had read about as a boy, Dostoevsky and Dickens and all of the great writers he loved, he says, you know, you always think that your anguish is your own, and then you start reading. And then he makes the next step, which is that he goes to another country, so to speak, and sees that lovelessness exists in the world in real ways. I always wonder if his father sort of won on some level in terms of convincing him that he was a loveless, not worthy of love person.
Wow.
It's heartbreaking to think about it, and that he looked for it in other disenfranchised people, you know, including his great friend Buford Delaney and lots of people who couldn't connect on that level, you know.
Wow. That's no, that's so powerful, because it's, you know, the tragedy of considering oneself not lovable, and yet also unrequited love can be a powerful posture for looking at the world. It seems related to that passage early in the book where he's talking about, you know, most people in action don't amount to very much, but we have to treat them as the miracles they are anyway. That's so. My next question, I wanted to ask Imani about Baldwin's account of the South, because of course, you know, a lot of this book is given over to his travels there and kind of how he felt doing journalism in the midst of the civil rights movement. He said it's where he discovered terror. It's certainly not an uncomplicated feeling he has about the South. He doesn't like grits, as he mentions at length.
Neither do I.
Lord have mercy.
I know. And it's like, please, Lord, help me.
And now the real fight on the panel begins.
And he said, Eddie's saying, you haven't had grits. That's the problem.
Baldwin says you're a marked man as soon as you don't like grits. But I wanted to ask Imani about, you know, especially since you're writing about this, what you think of Baldwin's account of the South, and particularly his idea that it's where America will be reborn, especially, you know, after what's happened in Georgia with Stacey Abrams the last week.
Yeah, so I mean, I think he's right about this, and he has this formulation in a number of texts, actually, in that, you know, it's not a kind of romanticized account, although he does fall in love with civil rights organizing in the South. But instead, just essentially what he's arguing is that, look, the projection of the nation's sins onto the South is a convenience, right, for those who reside in the North, who then in some ways capture, the South becomes held captive, right, to the logics of domination. And this goes back to, of course, to the wealth of the nation being built on cotton and the transatlantic slave trade and coal, and, you know, which really is, even though there are some northeastern parts of the country that, right, and oil, right, that the bounty of the nation is in part directly dependent on the suffering and exploitation of Black people in the Deep South. So if you want to get to the heart of the issue, that is where you have to go. And I I think that's right. I'm sort of echoing that argument, but I'm also fascinated by the way that he conceives of the South, both as a stranger and as as a place for homecoming. So he knows it has something to do with him. So for me, I try to tell this story in my next book about coming into a restaurant very similar to the way he did. I was in the Shenandoah Valley, and it became clear when I got in there that this was not where I was supposed to be. And this was just, 2016, right? Or 2017.
Wow.
But the grits were really good, right? And so part of I talk about the grits well prepared, and I like them better than low country grits because they were cooked all the way down the way that, and part of the argument is about the South varies quite dramatically, right? So there's something that there are things that he doesn't see because he doesn't, the South in some ways is undifferentiated. But there's again, this reckoning with the fact this is home and this is a wholly unfamiliar place. And I also, appreciate it because one of the things we miss about the Black Power era, there's just a lot of discussion about, the turn to radicalism, of course, and the return to Africa logic. But there's also a lot of invocation of the Deep South in that moment.
Mm.
Homeland, this notion of going back to that which existed before the fool's errand of desegregation. And that's really how it's conceived of. And you hear it again and again in writers of that era, this notion that we made an offer to the country, it turned its back on us. So now you turn back inward and go to the root to try to figure things out. And I think that, in fact, is part of his kind of, although he's very, very clearly, and Lorraine Hansberry shares this too, in political disagreement with nationalists on many counts, that there's a commitment to saying, yes, but they're right about so much of this, right? That there is an aspirational piece to not following along, right? There's a hope that it doesn't have to be this way, but there's a lot of the critique that is correct. And so, I mean, the South, I think that's right. I think that continues to be the case, not because, I do think there's a particular heroism to the South, as I'm a Southern chauvinist in certain ways, but because it is, I think, the heart of the nation. Mm. It is where the nation was built. There's a reason DC is in the South. There's a reason all those early presidents are Southerners, right? It sets the terms of the nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's such a great point about what's missed about Black Power. I've personally been interested in the Republic of New Africa, for example, which it seems like nobody ever talks about, but building a nation in the Deep South.
No, I agree with those folks. Yeah, that was the idea, was to see the Deep South seceding and building an African republic.
That's why the mayor of Jackson's name is Chokwe Lumumba. He comes out of a tradition that produced him and his father and people before him. Yeah, absolutely. Chokwe.
Yeah. So, of course, we're all coming to Baldwin at a time when everybody is in love with James Baldwin. Well, not everybody, but there's a lot of love for James Baldwin in our era, and I think with that has come some, he's been associated unfairly with certain things, like, for example, the kind of therapeutic turn in white anti-racism with like Robin DiAngelo and those kinds of ideas, like as though Baldwin's writing is about white people fixing themselves. And of course he says in No Name that it's not about this kind of individual transformation, and yet that misunderstanding has persisted. So my question is, how do you think Baldwin has been most misunderstood in this moment when his work has become so central?
I want to hear what Hilton has to say about this one.
Yes, I was.
he's burying his head in his hand. Julian, give me that to me one more time. I just want to make sure I have it correct in my mind.
Yeah, just in our current moment of Baldwin mania, how has he been most misunderstood, misappropriated?
Oh.
If you could fix anything about the way.
You mean an example of what was irritating to me?
Yes, both personally irritating to you and, you
Okay.
know, harmful to Baldwin's legacy and America and Black people, everything.
I
So,
think that one of the things that was shocking to me, and I feel I'm not going to mention any names, but one thing that was deeply shocking to me was the borrowing of Baldwin's hard-earned understanding of structure to talk about a situation that had nothing to do with Baldwin, and to talk about masculinity as one's own only. This had only happened to this person. And then Imani's book about her sons was, to me, such a counterbalance to that other sort of juggernaut situation. I was so grateful to Imani's book because I was deeply irritated by the other book that was a hetero. I hate saying this, but it was a heterosexualization of Baldwin's queer radicalism, and it really bothered me. And the fact that it was way more accepted than Baldwin's queer radicalism commercially, i.e. financially, in terms of guys talking about it and so on. I felt very angry for Baldwin on that score. It's sort of like, it was like Shaka Khan singing "I'm Every Woman" and then Whitney sings it, right?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
You know, I love Whitney like everybody else, but that's Shaka's song. And that's a hard-earned song for her. And it goes to our souls. And the other aspect of it is that the radicalism of his form, and that he is addressing a former self too, on some degree, just on some level, that gets cheapened and it sort of gets forgotten when there is a popular success based on the real thing, you know?
Yeah. Wow.
So that's the part that I'm, that's what it was very irritating to me, that happened.
yeah. No,
And I think Imani's book was an amazing antidote to that for me.
The heterosexualization is real.
Yeah.
You know, I know.
Julian, I'm gonna make a t-shirt out of that. I'm gonna wear that t-shirt. Heterosexualization is real. Yes.
Let's make t-shirts. But no, you know, I felt that way. You know, the book you're talking about, I think when I read it, I wasn't yet thinking about that sort of thing. But you know, when I saw "I Am Not Your Negro," and a lot of people said this, but you know, the choice of Samuel L. Jackson, for example, to voice Baldwin seemed like a very particular kind of choice, and the queer radicalism seemed kind of, you know, I mean, not that a straight actor has to voice a queer writer, but you know, still just the particular kind of masculinity that Samuel L. Jackson represents just felt like such a departure from the real human being.
Yes.
I want to thank you so much for saying that, Hilton.
Oh, that's fine. But your microphone, I think, you know what it is, Imani, I think when you sit like that, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. Is that better?
Much better.
Much better.
I wanted first to thank you for saying that, but I also think there's something about what we do to care for Baldwin that I think is also implied in what you're saying, which is, how do we nurture the queer radicalism, but also perhaps in the spaces where he doesn't love himself, how do we love him and love people through?
How do we help him? Because there's so much pressure on him to do everything.
Yeah.
And I think that we help him by arguing with him and saying, whoa, you just did a Jimmy. Hold up, back up. That was brilliant. But you left these steps out or these facts out or the rhetoric that was beautiful. I think by arguing with him in a loving way and in a vulnerable way. I feel very weepy during this conversation. It never ceases to amaze me how even the subject is so powerful for me. So I think it's just keeping him alive through discussion and argument, right? We have to help him because he couldn't do everything.
I mean, this is real. This conversation is really. Oh, I see you, James. It's hitting me hard in a number of different ways because I struggled with Begin Again in so many ways.
That was you gave me such courage, Eddie, to talk about that in the press. How you were like moving around trying to find out how to do it, like to be somewhere safe and left the fuck alone. Excuse my language. To write your book, and that was profound and liberating to me as a writer.
Yeah, but I just trying to deal with Baldwin and categorization.
Yeah,
is so hard, right? Because there's a sense in which, and I know we have to get to questions to the audience, but there's a sense in which Baldwin understands the trap. I mean, this is a through line. You can see it from Notes of a Native Son all the way to the Evidence of Things Not Seen, right? Mm-hmm. He understands the trap of the categories that kind of keep us permanently docked in the station. But then there are also these elements of his own sense of being loveless, feeling loveless, mm-hmm. his own sense of loneliness that leads to him kind of inhabiting a certain kind of masculinist discourse at times, shunning away from a certain kind of talk about sexuality and politics in a particular sort of way, right? And so there's a way in which I was trying to struggle with in the book was how to be true to how he talked about it in light of his critique of categories that bind, but at the same time keep track of the way in which he inhabits, right, space and time, right? You see what I mean? And so this is this is really helpful in so many ways. But anyway, that's just me just expressing. Sorry, Julian.
No, but what's so beautiful is that we've all helped each other. That's what's coming out, right?
Yeah.
I know I have been helped tremendously by this discussion. Really, we are all so lucky to have the three of you to talk with about this. This has been really such a nourishing and energizing discussion. So much.
We're just getting warmed up.
Well, we are. However, it's time. Time now.
I know.
to as much as I'd like to keep the three of you all to myself, that's not what I was asked to do this for. So we have some wonderful questions from the audience. So I'm just going to scan them quickly because I just received them.
Okay.
Julian, should we do another 10 minutes and I'll come back and wrap things up then?
Oh, you mean a break and then we come, or another 10 minutes of questions? Okay, yes, okay.
Well, we're going to end at
Perfect.
8. I learned a long time ago when I'm the least intelligent person in the room, I like to be quiet and listen to people talk. And I do not want to break this up. So
okay.
Did you have another question, Julian?
I had a few, but I'd be happy to just bring it to the audience because I think they've been.
Let's go, James. We can go. Because
Great.
I'm seeing this.
Sign off for a bit.
I'm seeing this number ticking away.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll see you all.
Okay. So I understood we're beginning with the audience questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but just for a little bit because I think we were solely supposed to go to 8, although I thought we were going to 30. But go ahead.
We're going to do 10 minutes. Okay. So let's see. So this is a question from someone. Professor Glaude makes the point that white America it is not yet ready to face its original sins, which is a point Baldwin makes continuously. Do you think we are ever going to see a change? Hard question.
I have to bank my all on it. Right? I don't buy into a kind of Schopenhauerian pessimism where I can sit in my study and drink sherry and say the world is hell. Nor do I subscribe to a kind of, this isn't Voltaire's Candide. This isn't the best of possible worlds either. What I do believe is that human beings are miracles and disasters at once. And so there's an opportunity. There's always a chance for a miracle, right? Always. And I have to bank my all on that. If I don't, Jimmy had his Johnny Walker, I have my Jameson, so.
Great answer. Another audience question. Oh, this is actually something I wanted to get to, so I'm glad I was reminded. When Jimmy talks about Eldridge Cleaver, he makes a distinction between the artist and the revolutionary. Can someone ever be both?
That was a very interesting point in the book, don't you?
Yeah.
Oh, don't you? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. People that come to mind are people like Audre Lorde, Grace Paley, people who are activists and artists and want to revolutionize, i.e. change the country. Filmmakers like Lizzie Borden or, for sure, wonderful Carolyn Forche, all great artists who were great activists and revolutionaries at the same time. Natalie Diaz. I feel that Jacqueline Woodson is a revolutionary, changing the ways in which children are read to or thought about. And she's a great writer. Absolutely.
So another question, this is from Prince Shakur. Prince asks, what role do you feel that catharsis plays in Baldwin's work and in imagining more liberated and radical futures?
That's so interesting because I experience him as a reader as someone who works to hold back the floodgates, right? And there are moments when they sort of spill over, like when he talks about bursting into tears at the funeral and holding it together until he's outside walking. And I think he's very careful with emotion, right? And so it's interesting. I don't think of him as a writer who deploys catharsis, but that may just be who I am as a reader of his work. I think of him as sort of, well, I don't know.
There's actually another question. You were mentioning funerals and kind of the way that Baldwin is controlled about emotion. How can contemporary artists continue to create, endure, hope, etc., while moving through similar challenges? As we're experiencing all this political grief and strife, how do we continue to create?
It's a great question.
Yes, it is.
How do we continue to create in the context of so much death and sorrow and grief? In some ways we have to bear witness to it all, right? That as we are experiencing it, we're not standing apart from it. And to bear witness to what is happening to us as a poet in the Emersonian sense, or as an artist, is to bring to bear, right, our sight, our vision, our skill set, our craft, to say something about what we are experiencing, so that we may get a fuller sense of what it means to be human as we make our way through this chaos, right? So there's this ongoing journey to death that we're all on from the very moment we started breathing. And the artist, the poet, offers a way of understanding that journey at a certain level of depth, gives us angles on it, allows us to see its meaning in particular ways. So as artists in this sort of moment, it seems to me it becomes even more imperative to bear witness, but not bear witness just in terms of chronicle, right? I'm not saying that, but to bear witness to the human effort to make meaning in the midst of darkness and sorrow, if that makes sense.
Complete sense. Beautiful.
Absolutely. Well, I think we are now, maybe we have time for one last question.
To make something beautiful of it, yeah. Go ahead.
So, I'm sorry, I'm just navigating this thread. Let's see, okay, so yeah, this is a kind of critical question about Baldwin. This may be our second to last. Someone is writing to say that, you know, Baldwin's escape has been seen as liberating and therapeutic, but I struggle with that when comparing Baldwin's story with the Black bodies unable to escape death at the hands of white supremacy. Does Baldwin's ability to flee make his pen and voice less credible for African Americans in the South?
No.
Nah.
I don't think so.
There's a kind, I mean, he's very, you know, there's a kind of romantic martyrdom. And I think this is important to talk about because I think there's a kind of romantic conversation in which we actually wind up, you know, sort of the chattering classes ventriloquizing the experiences of the most vulnerable amongst us, and then using them sort of really as a navel-gazing gesture ultimately. When in fact, as Eddie said, bearing witness is the obligation. That's the responsibility, right? Itself. There's actually a really interesting interview that Baldwin did where he's being critical of Langston Hughes that I keep reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't leave the hood. Like, why doesn't he leave? You know, and basically is saying Langston sort of puts on as though he's still sort of, you know, the man on the block. He talks just like my daddy. But one of the things that I think is so powerful is he says he renders lynching too precisely. It's not digestible. Part of the work of art is allowing us to digest it so that we can figure out how to make sense of it. And there's something about that he talks about art as also producing certain kinds of distances so that we can do something, right? And I do think there's a meaningfulness to that is very similar for me to understanding that watching videos of Black people being killed is actually not getting us closer to liberation, for example, right?
That's very well said. In fact, in that vein, I wonder if we could close with a question about imagining Black freedom. So Baldwin says in this book, of course, he doubts the leaders of the country have minds capable of encompassing the concept of Black freedom, which in the popular imagination has only been a nightmare. And question to all of you is, what would it mean to imagine Black freedom in America today? What would be a sign that that was starting to happen?
I guess if a big sign would be that the question didn't have to exist, right?
Hello.
Or the question, and let alone the statement or definition of it, wouldn't have to exist.
Yeah. And, you know, to be honest with you, Black freedom will, you know, we can begin to hear it when we finally see white folk leaving behind the idea that they ought to be valued more.
Right.
It's not on us.
Right.
In other words, we make life swing. We free.
Right.
So it's not us. I'm gonna flip it. I'm gonna give it back.
Earned.
I'm gonna give it back to you. Exactly.
Hilton. It's earned. We've earned it. It's earned. We've earned it.
Well, that seems like just a really beautiful way to end. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I
Thank
feel
you, Julian.
so privileged to have been a part of this discussion. I'm looking at the chat. A lot of people are feeling so lucky to have heard from the three of you. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you,
And
Julian.
I'll just do
Thank you, James. Thank
a
you, Eddie.
closing
Thank you, Imani.
pan out, you know, buy all of these, all worth it.
Thank you, Julian. Julian, be in touch, okay?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Wow.
James.
For those of us who
James?
work in book publishing, this is the part you don't have to pay us for, really, something like that. Thank you. Thank you.
James.
Eddie,
Good night, everybody.
Hilton, and Imani, and Julian, thank you so much for the discussion. We also, just before we close, want to thank once again our book selling partner for this program this month, which is Uncle Bobby's out of Philadelphia. Please buy James Baldwin books, Eddie S. Glaude Jr. books, Imani Perry books, Hilton Owls books, in the future, Julian Lucas books, and any book that you would want to buy for other people. Stop on by. You know, we want you to buy and read books. And lastly, before you go, because you joined us this evening, we're very happy to give you a sneak peek at this year's final selection for the Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group How Have I Not Read This Book Club, which will be Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. And we are lucky to have Chimamanda herself joining us for the virtual event in conversation with award-winning novelist Essie Adujan on Thursday, December 10th. Knopf's Lexi Bloom will moderate the evening. Our book-selling partner for this selection will be Changing Hands Bookstore, and you can order Chimamanda's and Essie's books from them now. And until then, thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, James. Bye-bye.
Y'all be safe, everybody. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hilton.